Sehr geehrte Gäste des heutigen Abends, liebe Preisträgerinnen, Jurymitglieder, Laudatorin, Kasaya, die uns mit Sanctuary ja schon begrüßt hat. Vielen Dank, dass Sie uns durch den Abend heute begleiten. Wir haben gestern einen ersten Tag gefeiert und viel über Alice Salomon und ihren Einfluss auf Familie, Freunde und unsere heutige Fachlichkeit in der Hochschule gesprochen. Und dabei wurde nochmal deutlich, wie international dieser Einfluss ist. Gestern Abend mit der Familie und mit Frau Chambon haben wir einen wunderbaren Abend verbracht und uns über Gott und die Welt unterhalten. Das hat mich sehr beeindruckt und auch, dass unsere Kooperationspartner im Erasmus-Kontext aus Nijmegen, Zürich, Gent und Zagreb heute einfach diese Woche angereist sind, um mit uns zu feiern, die Familie von Alice Salomon kennenzulernen und unsere Namensgeberin auf diese Art zu ehren. Vielen Dank für die internationale Freundschaft und den Besuch, den ihr uns hier abstattet. Das scheint mir im Augenblick, in der augenblicklichen politischen Lage, auch ganz besonders wichtig zu sein, diese internationalen Freundschaften zu leben, zu schätzen und zu genießen, mit Freude zu genießen. Und so sind auch unsere heutigen Abendgäste international. Es freut mich, dass Kasaya heute wenn ich Sie dem Publikum kurz vorstellen darf, Sie sind in Brüssel geboren, leben seit 2017 in Berlin und sind mit vielen Kulturen groß geworden, unterschiedlichen kulturellen Einflüssen, was auch Auswirkungen auf ihre Musik hatte, die Sie selber Nahrung für die Seele nennen. Vielen Dank, dass Sie diese Nahrung heute mit uns teilen. Und Nahrung für die Seele passt ja auch ganz gut zum heutigen Abend, an dem wir den Alice Salomon Award 2022 an Professor Dr. Adrienne Chambon verleihen, einer kanadischen Kollegin der Sozialwissenschaften, Professorin der Universität Toronto in der Fakultät Soziale Arbeit. Es freut uns sehr, dass Sie hier sind. Adrienne Chambon wuchs in Paris während der Nachkriegszeit auf und lebt heute zwischen Paris und Toronto, im Meer in Toronto, wie Sie gestern erzählt haben. Und wir sind ganz froh, dass wir Sie hier heute begrüßen können und dass Sie auch die Woche mit uns hier in Berlin verbringen. Ihre berufliche Laufbahn haben Sie begonnen als Sozialarbeiterin in Israel in den frühen 1980er Jahren, wo Sie unter anderem in einem Schutzhaus für misshandelte Frauen in Haifa gearbeitet haben. Und in Ihrer wissenschaftlichen Forschung haben Sie sich stets dafür eingesetzt, die Erfahrungen der Menschen sichtbar und erlebbar zu machen. Liebe Adrienne Chambon, Sie haben über Alice Salomon gesagt, sie sei eine inspirierende Persönlichkeit, eine begeisterte Pädagogin, eine fantasievolle Schriftstellerin und eine politische Intellektuelle. Wir ehren heute mit dem Alice Salomon Award der ASH Berlin Persönlichkeiten, die zur Emanzipation von Frauen, der Entwicklung der sozialen Arbeit Herausragendes beigetragen haben und die im übertragenen Sinne das Werk Alice Salomons unter heutigen Bedingungen weiterführen. To make the world a better place to live in war ihre Maxime im Handeln. Alice Salomons Arbeit trägt bis heute im Kontext der Theorieentwicklung der sozialen Arbeit, im Engagement für Gleichberechtigung, in der Anerkennung und Aufwertung sozialer und pflegender Berufe, deren immense Bedeutung für unsere Gesellschaft wir ja in den letzten 2 Jahren besonders deutlich erlebt haben. Und Alice Salomons Arbeit trägt eben in der Tradition bis heute auch uns in den Studienfächern, die wir an dieser Hochschule haben. Vor dem Hintergrund dieses Erbes steht die Alice Salomon Hochschule für eine Vollakademisierung der Sagefächer Soziale Arbeit, Gesundheit, Pflege und Erziehung und Bildung in der Kindheit. Auch das alles typische Arbeitsbereiche von Frauen. Ein wichtiger Schritt zur Vollakademisierung in Berlin ist geschafft, weil wir das Promotionsrecht jetzt auch an Hochschulen für angewandte Wissenschaften durch das Berliner Abgeordnetenhaus ermöglicht wurde. Es muss jetzt nur umgesetzt werden. Das dauert in Berlin immer noch ein bisschen. Damit sind die HWs endlich in der Lage, ihre eigenen Absolventen in diesen Disziplinen zu promovieren und so für wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchs zu sorgen. Allerdings, das haben wir auch gestern gelernt, zeigen über 100 Jahre Professionalisierung und Akademisierung in den Sageberufen auch, dass immer noch ein weiter Weg vor uns liegt. In Ihrer eigenen Arbeit, liebe Frau Chambon, setzen Sie diese Maxime, a world to make the world a better place to live in, auch fort. Auch Sie haben einen Beitrag geleistet zur Verwirklichung einer sozialen Gesellschaft in ständiger Auseinandersetzung mit der Praxis, dem Erleben der Menschen in der Gesellschaft, aber auch in der Theoriebildung eine Notwendigkeit für die Akademisierung. Dafür gebührt Ihnen Dank und Anerkennung. Ich glaube, es ist mal ein Applaus wert. Es ist uns also eine große Freude und Ehre, Ihnen, Frau Chambon, heute den Preis zu verleihen. Was uns dazu bewegt hat, wird Ariane Fröstl gleich beschreiben und ihr Lebenswerk wird von den Laudatorinnen Susanne Maurer, Julia Winkler und Stefan Köngeter gewürdigt. Liebe Frau Fröstl, ich darf an Sie übergeben.
Ja, liebe Anwesende, sehr verehrte liebe Adrienne Chambon, ich habe die Freude, Ihnen die Begründung der Jury des Alice Salomon Awards 2022 vorzutragen. Sie lautet: Mit Adrienne Chambon ehren wir eine Person, die sich einerseits als Intellektuelle um die Theoriebildung in der sozialen Arbeit sehr verdient gemacht hat, deren wissenschaftliche und praktische Arbeit aber immer auch das Politische und Emanzipatorische zum Ziel hat. Nicht zuletzt hat sie gezeigt, dass die Archivarbeit in der sozialen Arbeit gestärkt werden sollte, um die Disziplin mit einem kritischen Blick in die Vergangenheit weiterentwickeln zu können. Mit ihrem gemeinsam mit Alan Eyring und Laura Epstein 1999 herausgegebenen Buch Reading Foucault for Social Work, das internationale Verbreitung gefunden hat, hat Adrienne Chambon die theoretische Perspektive der sozialen Arbeit erweitert und inspirierte mehrere Generationen von Wissenschaftler und Wissenschaftlerinnen, Praktiker und Praktikerinnen der sozialen Arbeit. Die Erfahrung von Adressaten sozialer Arbeit sichtbar, hörbar, greifbar und erfahrbar zu machen, ist ein vorrangiges Ziel der wissenschaftlichen Forschung von Adrienne Chambon, vor allem die in der Gesellschaft marginalisierten Erfahrungen von Frauen, von geflüchteten Menschen und indigenen Menschen. Es zeichnet Adrienne Chambon aus, dass sie ihre wissenschaftliche Arbeit stets mit praktischem Engagement verbunden hat, wie zum Beispiel durch ihre Mitarbeit im kanadischen Zentrum für Folteropfer und die Förderung und Unterstützung von Geflüchteten und Exilierten beim Aufbau einer eigenen Perspektive und Karriere. Zu den Verdiensten von Adrienne Chambon gehört ihr Engagement für die Archivarbeit. Sie hat Quellen- und Archivforschung auch methodisch vorangetrieben und zahlreiche Projekte angeregt, unter anderem als Mitglied des ersten wissenschaftlichen Beirats des Alice Salomon Archivs und aktuell als Mitglied eines kreativen Thinktanks, der die Geschichten der sozialen Arbeit in einer transnationalen Perspektive auf einer Online-Plattform sichtbar machen will, ganz in der Tradition der internationalen und auch transatlantischen Netzwerke von Alice Salomon. Adrienne Chambon hat der sozialen Arbeit in Theorie und Praxis entscheidend wichtige und inspirierende Impulse gegeben, mit denen sie einen unverzichtbaren Beitrag zur Weiterentwicklung des von Alice Salomon begründeten Konzepts der sozialen Arbeit geleistet hat. Soweit die Begründung der Jury. Ich erlaube mir eine kurze persönliche Bemerkung anzuschließen. Ich hatte das große Glück, Adrienne Chambon vor 10 Jahren kennenzulernen, und zwar im Rahmen einer Arbeitsgemeinschaft, Arbeitsgruppe mit dem Titel Working with Archives. Sie waren zu Gast im Alice Salomon Archiv, und es war für mich eine ganz wunderbare, ziemlich einzigartige Erfahrung einer solchen Arbeitsgruppe, die so repressionsfrei, so offen gearbeitet hat, sich den Dokumenten, speziell auch Fotos von Archiven gewidmet hat. Und auf eine eindrucksvolle Weise produktiv dabei geworden ist und wirklich unterschiedliche Assoziationen, Informationen, so still geleitet von Adrienne Chambon, in Erkenntnis transformiert hat. Ich erwähne das auch, weil unser Team der Laudatoren und des Laudators diese Wertschätzung von Archiven und der Arbeit mit Archivdokumenten teilen und an dieser Arbeitsgruppe vor 10 Jahren und folgenden Veranstaltungen teilgenommen hat. Und damit möchte ich das Wort übergeben an das Team. Das besteht, wir haben es ja schon gehört, von Professor Dr. Susanne Maurer, Sozialpädagogik-Professorin an der Philipps-Universität Marburg seit vielen, vielen Jahren und eine der profiliertesten Feministinnen in dem Feld, würde ich mal sagen. Dann werden wir hören Julia Winkler, Dr. Julia Winkler, Dozentin für Fotografie und Visual History, war in der Arbeitsgruppe ganz, ganz wichtig, Fotointerpretation, an der Universität of Brighton und der School of Art and Media. Und schließlich als Vertreter, Herr Professor Dr. Stefan Köhngeter, Professor für Soziale Arbeit an der Fachhochschule St. Gallen in der Schweiz. Ja. Susanne Maurer, Ihre Bühne.
So, ich hoffe, Sie sehen es uns nach, dass wir unsere Laudatio in englischer Sprache halten, mit unterschiedlichen Akzenten, Einfärbungen. Sprechen wir das einfach für Adrienne Chambon und diejenigen, die vielleicht eher Englisch sprechen und heute Abend hier sind, aber wir haben ja das Privileg und den Luxus, dass übersetzt wird. Also insofern in beide Richtungen. Vielen Dank. We are delighted to be here with you all tonight to celebrate Professor Adrienne Chambon's extraordinary achievements and important international contributions to the field of social work history, theory, and practice. To talk about a person with so many facets is both an honor and a challenge. When writing this speech together, the three of us reflected on the best ways to do this. We asked ourselves from which position or positions we should speak, what to foreground, what to leave out. We believe that Adrienne herself would take these questions very seriously, and we hope to be able to do justice to her work and legacy in this cooperative laudatory contribution. We reflected on the challenge of talking about rather than with Adrienne. Joachim Wieler put yesterday the wonderful word zusammensetzen in der bei aller Auseinandersetzung, and Adrienne likes to speak about her work in terms of conversations. Thus, we would like to follow Adrienne's biography a little bit. It was already mentioned in the speech of our colleague from the Alice Salomons University. We like to follow a little bit Adrienne's biography and achievements through our own encounters with her and reflect them under the headline of under the headline of Knowledge and Practice for Solidarity. So here it's the other way around. This motto is one of the most important connecting points for our experiences with Adrienne, and also very much connects to the work of Adrienne itself. Indeed, Knowledge for Solidarity, a critical cultural theory for social work, was the title of one of her major research projects. And it is Knowledge and Practice for Solidarity that we do also find in the work of Alice Salomon. So this makes one of quite a few affinities between the two of them. In this talk, we will highlight just a couple of the complex strands and multiple layers of Adrienne Chambon's research approach and foreground her inclusive, considered, and careful research practice, as well as her generosity in facilitating collaborations and networks through which she has enabled transnational connections in many countries, including Canada, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Taiwan, Kazakhstan, and Israel over many decades. After childhood spent in Paris, it was already mentioned, Adrienne completed her first degrees in sociology at the University of Nanterre in 1968 and 1970. So these were the wild years. And at the age of 26, she moved to Israel with family, where she continued her studies in social work, already mentioned also. After living and working in Israel for 7 years, Adrienne moved to the United States, where she obtained her PhD at the University of Chicago and held academic posts there, as well as in New Jersey. She moved to Toronto, Canada in 1991 to take up a post at the University of Toronto Faculty of Social Work, where she became a highly respected professor, PhD and MA supervisor. Across several decades, she taught a large number of courses and had many roles, including as director of doctoral studies. Here we can also find an interconnection with Alice Salomon, both of them being inspired and inspiring teachers. I put it in, yes, because you will see why. Each in her very own way, being highly committed to knowledge creation in cooperative networks. To come back to Adrienne's places to be, Toronto was and continues to be her base, while also traveling back and forth between Canada and France, as well as other places in Europe and beyond. You heard already about this. And now Julia will continue, and I try to find a new slide.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? I first met Adrienne Chambon in 1994 when I had the great fortune to have her as my MA dissertation supervisor on the social work course at the University of Toronto, which Adrienne had recently joined from the University of Chicago. In group seminars, we would present ideas and research methodologies in a supportive and critical environment, discussing the uses of photography, from photoelicitation to working with archival images, to making new collaborative images with research participants as co-researchers, as important tools in doing social work research. We practiced the careful reading. It's okay, better like this? Sorry. We practiced the careful reading of images and narratives, listened to silences and gaps in recorded conversations, focusing not just on what was said, but how it was said and in which language. It was no surprise that Adrienne repeatedly received the Faculty of Social Work Excellence in Teaching Award. Over the many years that followed, Adrienne became an important mentor, inviting me along with many other colleagues to participate in research collaborations. She's been a dedicated ally and supportive friend. Throughout her whole working life, and with huge personal commitment and curiosity, she has also nurtured and encouraged the research and projects of a very long list of PhD and MA students, colleagues, and friends. Adrienne is a deeply accomplished practitioner, writer, thinker, reader, and a compassionate listener. Her work has significantly expanded the field of social work history, and through her careful forensic approach, in tandem with far-reaching transnational inquiry, she has made connections between micro and macro histories, focusing on marginalized, untold stories, often, but not exclusively, of women and children, of migrants and displaced people. A key feature of her approach is the idea to claim and make space for a multiplicity of voices, of perspectives, experiences, and actions, and to nurture the practice of dialogue and active citizenship. She has achieved this through a range of strategies, a crucial one being the activation and reactivation of archives, paying close attention to visual representations. For example, in an earlier project, Adrienne explored an idealized representation of a just society by mobilizing a series of frescoes painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the early 14th century in Siena. These frescoes work as allegorical representations of good and bad governance during the Middle Ages. Whereas in the example of bad governance, the town and surrounding countryside have been destroyed, with houses in ruins and farmland lying dry and barren. In the example of good governance, residents are able to organize and administer their lives collectively in a fair way as free and active citizens. They live in an area full of abundance and peace. These frescoes were used from the 19th century onwards at the time of nation-state building as an important example for what a free democratic space could look like, with citizens organized civic and communal structures together. Rereading and interpreting these Italian frescoes in relation to the field of social policy and welfare, an imperative concern was to explore and trace how, across time and space, some communities were included within the public sphere and able to enact their citizenship fully, while others were and continue to be excluded and marginalized by governments, professional, and economic bodies. To show how Adrienne has explored these ideas, I want to briefly zoom in one of her most recent projects called Social Work and the Wished-For City, claiming spaces for women and children in early 20th century Toronto. This developed out of the already mentioned Knowledge for Solidarity project that Susanne talked about at the beginning, an interdisciplinary collaborative project Adrienne Chambon initiated in order to investigate agency and community social work archives and practices, focusing on the careful re-examination of visual and text-based archival material. For the Wished-For City, Adrienne Chambon invited an interdisciplinary team of 6 colleagues, which included Professor Ernie Lightman from the University of Toronto, who is also with us here tonight and sitting over there. Working together as a team, our starting point was to look at the visual archives of several Toronto social welfare institutions and public service agencies, including public health and planning department records. These photographs, the photographs we examined, had been taken by various professional photographers in the early decades of the 20th century as part of a series of administrative surveys to document the housing conditions in an established working-class neighborhood in central Toronto where successive waves of immigrants and refugees would settle upon arriving in Canada. We also mobilized transnational archives and looked at other survey photographs made in Europe at the same time. Our approach when working with these archival sources followed several steps. An intense examination of agency photographs, paying close attention to the image's content, context, and their circulation. Bringing socioeconomic questions to these images, our line of inquiry included asking, how do photographic practices both hide and reveal perspectives of value in the recording of cities and their inhabitants? We asked what stories these material sources tell, acknowledging complexity and multiplicity of meaning, by bringing together and investigating a range of archival source material and making visible the materiality, uses, reuses, and circulation of archival documents across time and space, new contexts and deeper meanings came to the surface. We were attentive to the fact that these sets of photographs not only documented the living conditions of disadvantaged families, but frequently they also included representations of children at work and at play, highly visible as participants at street corners, on thresholds, in lanes, and emerging playgrounds of transforming and expanding urban spaces. But depending on the commissioning department or organization, the presence of the children in the photographs was either used to elicit pity or to strengthen arguments to clear these areas, or very often both. Yet when we paid close attention to the children in these photographs, we would notice children's creative use of space, their interactions, their confident movement, their gestures, their use of the streets as playgrounds in the absence of actual playgrounds. We reflected that in these photographs, the photographers had inadvertently captured moments in which children had transfigured and negotiated the world they occupied through creative play into civic spaces of possibility and of promise. We found commonalities across the regions we studied of many of these neighborhoods being seized for commercial development under the pretext of so-called slum clearance. One of the patterns that emerged was that frequently an official commission would be undertaken to document in detail these high-density neighborhoods. Then the notion of slum was invoked, and we realized that in many cases the documents were then used as evidence for new renewal policies, and centrally located neighborhoods were broken up as early as the 1910s and as late as the 1970s. Following demolition, residents were usually rehoused on the urban peripheries away from the center, leading to further marginalization and exclusion. Therefore, a further question brought to the archival images was, how can these sets of images be activated through curation to give emotional understanding of the individuals and communities they represented, whose living spaces were broken up? This is an important question, as popular, low-income resident areas in towns and cities across the world are still frequently either demolished or become gentrified in the wake of commercial development. In these neoliberal conditions, socioeconomic inequalities are widening, and with them the threat to the fabric of cities themselves. As a team, we developed publications and exhibitions, with audience interaction and participation being key features. We enlarged images and reanimated them. The exhibition sought to open novel ways of visualizing historical research, highlighting problematic continuities, activating emotional responses, while also giving back historical archives to the public sphere and bringing them to new and younger audiences, including children, who in some cases felt a sense of connection and empathy with the communities and the children recorded in the archival photographs. In her ongoing work, Adrienne Chambon has explored the connections between social work knowledge and the arts, highlighting and advocating the importance of socially engaged arts and participatory arts in offering alternative ways of knowing and understanding. The practice of activating the visual archive and making creative interventions makes it possible to imagine a wished-for city, a space, a society that is more just, that has a future where historically oppressed and marginalized communities and children of every country are a central and much valued part of the fabric of society and shape decision-making processes, as was the case in the Siena fresco exemplifying good governance. Over to Stefan now.
So I would like to continue with the topic of recognizing and crossing boundaries. It's more about the transnational part of Adrienne's work. As a young man from a rural Catholic part of southern Germany, I was late that I entered the international academia. And it was Adrienne who opened this world for me. I had my PhD finished and was part of this research training group, Transnational Social Support, as a postdoc. It was there when I first met Adrienne, who was part of the group of international scholars in this research training group, together with Ernie Leitman. Her interest in transnationalism differed from the mainstream research that was done in this field. Transnational studies were mostly focused on the ongoing interconnections of people, ideas, objects, and capital across the borders of nation-states. Adrienne Chambon pointed out to two important dimensions which were neglected at the time, at least in the field of social work. First of all, she brought in historical depth into the discourse of transnational social support by revealing that these processes of robust connections across national boundaries are not new, but have a long history. The historical creation and transformation of connections across national boundaries, the spaces of interaction across social groups who became nations, and the ongoing translations across people speaking different or also same languages. All of this could be found for a long time. And it is important to know and understand all of this, especially now. This is what Adrienne Chambon emphasized here. Secondly, she asked crucial questions about the ongoing inclusion and exclusion of groups, people, and communities, also in the discourse of transnationalism. Who is excluded from this new discourse on transnationalism? What kind of presumptions flow into the discourse on transnationalism? Who is able to articulate these perspectives? It is one of these striking examples of Adrienne Chambon's virtuosity in unveiling the hidden agenda of discourses by asking the right questions at the right time. She's an academic in its truest sense. She is not giving quick answers, but an academic artist who raises the important questions. Adrienne Chambon deciphered the discourse on transnationalism and its deep roots in Western thinking on nationhood. The Western history of celebrating the nation in the 19th and 20th century, the reflection on the devastating consequences of this delusion, and finally, the attempt to overcome national boundaries. All of this flows into the discourse on transnationalism. However, there are groups who are again not recognized, again excluded from this discourse, have again not the possibility of entering into this discourse. These are, for example, refugees, which are hardly mentioned there, and also indigenous communities, as Adrienne Chambon emphasized. Since the discourse is so biased by its own history, the important transnational interrelations of First Nations in the Americas to settler communities are not considered as transnational. This leads to the consequence that First Nation communities were again not considered to be important actors with its own rights, own perspectives, and own discourses. True solidarity across boundaries is only possible if we are willing to reflect on inclusion and exclusions that go along with knowledge and practice of solidarity. But what is important here, Adrienne Chambon's critique does not stop here. It's not only critical, but it's productive, in a double sense, on the level of knowledge creation and of practice. In an intriguing article, she argues that the discourse of multiculturalism, dominant in Canada by the settler communities, and the discourse of self-government, dominated by First Nation communities in Canada, only partly share a common understanding of the world. What are the consequences of this dilemma? That we are living in societies with groups and communities who hardly share common terminologies, common understandings of the world, whose facts of the one group are fakes for the other, and vice versa. This is a particularly thorny question in past as in present, and particularly in these days when again people or groups of people aim or threaten to extinguish the other group. There are no easy answers for this question, and Adrienne Chambon always refrained from easy answers. Instead, she insists on the recognition of differences in the respective worldviews, in finding joint commonalities, and in supporting those who suffered most from the disrespect of others. This is how she established the large network of international scholars, not in exploiting this network for her own power, but to enable true encounters among those who need it most. It is this silent, almost invisible work which is the most valuable part of her transnational practice of solidarity.
Okay, tut mir leid, ich habe gerade festgestellt, dass die letzten Blätter meines Ausdrucks fehlen. Mit dem ganz kurzen Schluss. Und ich versuche das jetzt zu improvisieren. Auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch? Ich versuche mal auf Englisch. Okay, I have to improvise, like often in life and in social work, because suddenly a certain kind of resource is lacking and missing and just gone lost. So this is the case right now, because I was not so, I was a bit nervous in advance of this celebration event, and I did not count the pages, and I did not really control if I have everything. So the very last part, it's 1.5 pages, so I make it short, is missing. So I try to take the essence of what was meant to be there. And maybe I can come back to the wonderful song you sang to us in the beginning, because you were singing of gentleness, of kindness somehow, of love, of hatred, and of the importance of a loving kind of being and thinking and receiving and acting. That's how it was received by myself, so thank you again for that. And maybe this is a quality we wanted to especially underline and highlight in the end of our laudatory speech. I found quite complicated words for it, but maybe it's better if I don't read it. I try to improvise. I think the main quality which was very important to the three of us and also to me myself was the quality of listening to the unheard voices. And I think you have already heard about this in the part of Julia and the part of Stefan. And also what my colleagues would mention, a certain kind of praxis which is really doing a very honest or trying to be very honestly and seriously with the attempt of listening and bringing by that kind of approach forward the formerly unheard voices. And these are not only unheard voices, but these are the silenced voices, sometimes the extinguished and forgotten by history or by historical representations and knowledge tradition processes, the forgotten voices. And what I found always very impressive and interesting, when Adrienne would when Adrienne would also take into account the work of art of very diverse kinds. So especially when it comes to indigenous groups and voices and experience, and they try to intervene by means of the arts. For example, may it be by film, by film production, by documentaries, may it be by exhibitions, by works of arts in the streets, by performances, to somehow tell the stories, I have to say, of what happened altogether, what happened to them, and who and how the very diverse people somehow being part of that story and histories could relate to that forgotten, lost, extinguished experience. So I'm sorry that I cannot express myself better, but I just wanted to say that I think, as well as students, as well as colleagues from practical fields of social work, as well as colleagues from research fields, could learn by listening to these other voices, even if they have not been articulating themselves in spoken language, but in the language of the body, in the language of sound without articulated word, in the language of images. So the whole taking into account imaginaries, like the wished for city was telling also, the project, seems to be a very precious way to listen in a way that is also to learn from others and not to teach the others. Therefore, coming back to my Anführungszeichen, being an inspiring teacher, it's really more about being an inspired and inspiring listener and learning together with others. So maybe I make it short, but maybe this last sentence or last word thought, that we found there can be an activity, a praxis, a creation of a space where questions can come into being in the first place, where question can come at all into existence and can be told and can be heard and can be listened to and then can be worked at or worked on. And I think for me it's a very kind way of doing theorizing, of doing research. I wanted to start with the Foucault book and so on, but I forgot all about it right now. Maybe the one thing which is very important and which is a final interconnection to Alice Salomon, which I don't want to neglect, is when I listen to Adrienne, when I read her work, when I can be with her by exploring the world and realities and the untold stories, I have to think sometimes of the little book of Michel Foucault, Infame Menschen. If anybody's interested, we can talk about it later. And I have to think about the book of Alice Salomon, Soziale Diagnose, from 26, because there Alice Salomon will talk about also the art of living, not only the art of helping, the art of living, and she will talk about the danger to not respect the borders, the boundaries, the limits of the other's space, the space of the other. And she will talk about respect of the way people will lead their lives, live their lives. She will talk about respect to acknowledge and see and receive what is their exhaustion or their struggle to survive and to live their life. And she talks about the danger to overwhelm, to define their situation, to define their problems. And I think there she has a crucial point, which can teach us something in social work, but not only in social work, to be more decent, to be more listening than talking, to be more trying to hear the formerly unheard voices and to take them really into account, especially if we are really honestly trying to go for the process of decolonization. So that was a kind of memory of Alice Salomon's work while reflecting on Adrienne Chambon's work. And finally, we want to congratulate you really from our hearts, because we think it's not only a sentence, it's not only words to talk about knowledge for solidarity. It's a very human, a very kind, a very gentle practice. And therefore, we are really deeply grateful. Thanks a lot.
I've never put an award on the wall. I never thought it was really helpful for anything. But I think this award, this particular award, I am going to put on the wall. I think it's extremely moving. It's extremely moving for me, thank you, to receive this award. I was very surprised, I must tell you. I had no idea it was coming. And so when I received your letter, Dagmar, saying, would you consider, I said, consider. Is this a real letter? Is this coming from a real person? I have no idea. So, and then I realized it was very real. So thank you very much. I really am very honored by this. So I'm not a specialist of Alice Salomon, and you'll see that soon, but I wanted to put it out there. Okay, I called this talk, We Need Alice Salomon Today. Today, I wish to share with you some thoughts that celebrate Alice Salomon as a reclaimed historical figure and as a source of inspiration in these troubled times. I wrote this before the war in Ukraine and Russia, but some of it is even more real today. I will focus on some aspects of her approach that I find particularly relevant. My thesis is that Alice Salomon and what she stands for is very much needed today. Another way to say it is, if only Alice Salomon were here. So, Clea, the muse of history, is agitating. History is not a continuous ribbon that we unfurl and spool back. There are peaks and valleys, calm moments, and moments of turmoil and transformation. As historian Karl Scholzke argues, there are times in history when history becomes appealing, even urgent, when it resonates with present circumstances. In classical Greek times, Cleo, the muse of history, was represented seated beside an open chest and holding in her hands an open scroll. History is not a closed book. It makes itself known and can be accessed and interpreted many, many times. After Alice Salomon's lengthy disappearance from the record of stories told, what she pursued and what she achieved in her context of uncertainty and turmoil, including war, speak to us more than in earlier periods of certainty and optimism. Before I continue, I wish to acknowledge a number of people whose influence is present in this lecture. Susanne Maurer, Stefan Koen-Goethe, Julia Winkler, Adrienne Chambon, you're exactly seated along the lines that and your immense work with assembling documents and creating the archive, followed by the attentiveness and commitment of Diana Lau, and Frédéric Emel. And also acknowledge Joachim Wheeler and Dessa, the artist. As I came to know of Alice Salomon through reading about her work, some of her writings, through conversations, she moved into my present and was no longer a figure of the past. With that shift, a broader range of emotions overwhelmed me. Next to the sense of admiration and respect I held for her, emerged a feeling of longing and nostalgia. Can we feel nostalgia about a time and a place that existed earlier, even prior to our birth, that we did not experience directly? In the transmission of stories about such times, about actions and images that attach to certain ideas, ideals, even bursts of utopia, we can experience nostalgia as a political feeling, missing something that is uncannily familiar, to quote Freud. Alongside the general contemporary mood of depression that cultural theorist Anne Svetkovich has described as a pervasive public feeling, we look for and yearn for alternative political emotions based on desire, feelings of elation, happiness, and involvement. Certain figures, past and present, evoke such possibilities, and Alice Salomon is one such figure. I'm going to take a drink each time between each section. So. Okay. There are feelings tied to the creation of settings. Troubled and turbulent times are open to the transformation of ideas, of practices, of organizations. Existing fields are being reconsidered, and new fields are being created. Alice Salomon was a creator, an instigator, a doer, and an activist. With the creation of new ways of living come particular feelings. In the creation of settings and the future societies, which refer to the 60s and 70s, Seymour Saracen, a social psychologist, describes the joy and excitement that accompany new ways of working together, the shaping of new practices and new relationships. It is thrilling to take up the space to initiate, to mold a different reality from a need and a vision. It also requires determination. Alice Salomon said to rethink what existed in her time and circumstances and mold a different reality without a blueprint to guide her. She chose to proceed step by step. These qualities and posture are much needed today when we no longer imagine forging a glowing future ahead of us. Alice Salomon was not alone. I can't call her Salomon, and I don't feel close enough to call her Alice, so I go to Alice Salomon. She wasn't alone. She was part of a generation of women who became leaders in society and created entire fields where they could be leaders. These women contributed to a new world, as Sheila Rowbotham argued for the UK and the US in Dreamers of a New Day, Women Who Invented the 20th Century. Among them, I thought of the artist Kate Kollwitz, born 5 years before Salomon, the first woman to study art at the Academy of Berlin. Kollwitz shared comparable interests with Alice Salomon. Her powerful engravings of the immense energy in peasant revolts showed the need for a collective response to social injustice. Yet, after her son died in World War I, she made prints and sculptures of mother and child, showing the limitless tenderness and the unbearable pain of a mother losing her child to war. I am somewhat familiar with the work of Kollwitz. The Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto owns several of her prints and has organized several exhibits of her work. It was a time when women were gaining rights in Germany, the right to education, for instance, followed by the right to vote. Salomon further benefited from the legal and social emancipation of Jews who gained access to education and to a range of careers and could contribute as full citizens. This came to an abrupt end, of course, with the National Socialist regime. I would like to talk to her, or to her also, and about her as an intellectual in social work. I think of Alice Salomon as a humanist. She spoke many languages besides German and English. And what I have in mind are the languages of an economist, feminist writing, the language of caring, and the language of friendship. She was curious, always questioning. She started from something that she felt wasn't quite right or made no sense, such as doing nothing about the divided state of society. This sense of discrepancy as motivation reminded me of the sociologist Dorothy Smith, for whom incongruence between institutional discourse and the realities of women is the trigger, the spark for new research. More recently, the French philosopher Barbara Cassin stated in an interview that feminist research often shows a particular sensitivity to discrepancy. Alice Salomon was smart. She was restless. One could say that Salomon's focus on social justice was fostered through her restless curiosity. Salomon was a prolific author and speaker. I was particularly struck by the breadth of interest that she held within the emergent field of social work. On the one hand, she translated the writings of Mary Richmond, whose orientation to practice was influenced by the medical field and by individual casework. This is where the notion of case comes from in social work. Yet it is worth noting that Richmond, at the time, gave a lot of consideration to economics as part of the context of social cases, not individual cases, social cases, which is something that has been forgotten in the simplified mythical account of social work. On the other hand, Alice Salomon was known for her close friendship with Jane Addams, of course, and the settlement house movement, and came to be seen, as you know, as the Jane Addams of Germany. This is reducing her. I mean, to say she's the Jane Addams of Germany sounds, but at the same time, there is something to that. Well, Salomon insists in her writing, and I'm basing myself here on her autobiography in English, on the value of the individual. In the very same sentence, we could say in the very same breath, she is arguing for collective rights. She did not want to lose sight of the individual in her community-centered and policy perspectives. It is this balancing principle between the individual and the collective that intrigued me and that interrogates social work. Today, these two paths of social work have drifted apart, have become more than different emphases. In our time of specialization, they have become distinct fields, no longer one, embodied by distinct groups of practitioners and shaped by different educational pathways. Disciplinary splits and recompositions are something to consider anew in the present moment when new professional arenas and new educational frameworks are being carved out. New configurations are emerging. What is it that we want in this respect? Consider another fundamental debate in social work, the squabble between theory and practice. Is social work a field of practice, a profession, or an academic endeavor, or all of these? If all, how do we integrate these facets? The tension over theory and practice is an old one. It has not been resolved over time. We can see it reflected in social work curricula, in classrooms, in field placements, with a recurrent suspicion about the place of theory within social work and I have experienced it directly, so I do know what I'm talking about here. This was not an issue for Alice Salomon. For her, theory and practice worked together and influenced each other in a continuous loop. In her autobiography, Salomon writes of her thirst for studies and the pleasure of working through ideas when she attended courses at the university. She studied economics and loved it. Her work, which turned into her thesis, questioned the wage difference between men and women, a topic that hasn't gone away. She discovered philosophy, and she loved it. Although she did not lose sight of complex policy strands and had great analytical acumen, she saw broader scholarship, particularly new questions, being addressed as a means of transforming society. She brought contemporary philosophical debates to the School of Social Work that she founded. And, quote, we had lectures from the great scholars of our time. Lectures by Einstein, Carl Jung, Ernst Cassirer, Romano Guardini. For her, this was to be a two-way exchange, and this is very rare, in which both sides benefited. Their exchange was contributing knowledge and open thinking and debate to social work, and social workers bringing broad knowledge and society and new practices to the philosophers, all with a view to changing society. This outlook seemed devoid of hierarchies among types of knowledge and is quite extraordinary. Salomon created frameworks for social work education and frames for thinking. As an educator and teacher, she encouraged debate, self-learning, and self-reflection in the classroom. Her stand on reflectivity was rather unusual for the period. In that sense, she was ahead of her time. Adrienne Chambon wrote that Alice Salomon was not a rigorous, dogmatic person, either as a knowledge person or as a teaching person. Understanding was to be open-ended. Railing against the Prussian educational reforms of 1906 that were presented as progressive, Salomon judged them as not better than a finishing school for women. And in response, she writes, I prepared an alternative to the government plan, stressing education for citizenship and a really systematic foundation for professional social work. These notions are still relevant today, but often fragile, when teaching is often compressed and spaces of freedom are limited by the standardization of educational programs. Alternative ways of thinking about education can be developed against the grain. Salomon's statement, education for citizenship, reminds me of the distinction that Pierre Bourdieu has made between an academic scholar who specializes in a certain knowledge field, but at the same time is circumscribed by it by definition, and an intellectual who has a broader vision. Salomon's stance is also compatible with Michel Foucault's call in his text, Parésia, for the obligation to speak the truth and the courage and commitment to challenge accepted ideas. Also compatible with Edward Said's notion of a public intellectual. A different aspect of her broad outlook of Alice Salomon is her interest for the arts. We heard that she was very close to the Mendelssohns and through them became friends with a number of artists and musicians. As an illustration, the acting of Eleonora Duse very much moved her, and she wrote, she, Duse, not only acted, it was life itself, sorrow, suffering, agony, and despair. She stirred me as only reality ever had. Here we have yet again the sense of multi-layered worldview and a way of living with great sensitivity, which Dessa captures in her fine artistic works. I quote here Adrienne in her introduction, a new introduction, to Dessa's book. Salomon believed in the power of art to serve as a bridge, linking social interventions to the broader philosophy and spirituality of living. A last theme I wish to dwell on is Alice Salomon's position on local knowledge and transnational understandings. As transnational communication has become the object of much research today, many of Salomon's stances remain highly relevant. Besides playing a leading role in local and national organizations of women, she was very active in international organizations of women and in those feminist networks that sustain long-lasting friendships. A regular correspondent with the International Labour Organization in Geneva during the Weimar Republic, what became the ILO, she represented Germany in international meetings and was a regular conduit for the exchange of ideas and practices across national borders. Thus, it was not surprising that she was chosen as the first director of the International Schools of Social Work. Existentially, Alice Salomon loved to travel and felt most herself when she did. Travel could satisfy her curiosity to see for herself what existed elsewhere and assess the grounding of experimental social alternatives. In his recent memoir entitled Home in the World, the economist Amartya Sen insists on the value of being beyond a single confined identity. In the chapter The Presence of the Past, he turns to early plays in Sanskrit that make the same point. End quote. The perception that human identity does not demand a singular confinement came to me quite powerfully from the ancient classics. Think of the heroine of Shudraka's play, known in English as the Little Clay Cart, from around the 4th century. A radical and subversive play that offers several themes. One of them was the need to see a person as having many identities. This was an idea that helped me, he says, to resist the imposition of a single, overwhelming identity based on religion or community. Of Alice Salomon, we can say that she was at home in the world. She actively resisted the confinement of a single identity. Yet, the late 19th, beginning 20th century saw the growth of nationalism in all spheres of life. Alice Salomon did not share such feelings. The cause of nationalism wasn't hers. And she wrote, "There was not a grain of nationalistic enthusiasm in me." At the start of World War I, she made the comment, "I had worked for world relations and they were gone, replaced by the war machine and all the destruction it entails." Very relevant to today. Her stance reminded me of the beautiful text by Jacques Derrida called Cosmopolites de tous les pays, encore un effort. Cosmopolitans of all countries, sustain yet another effort. This was a text he prepared for an international meeting of writers on the right of asylum, proposing to remove the decision-making process from the state authority being increasingly diluted by various interests, and instead to relying on cities to preserve the full principle of asylum for strangers. Cities of asylum. Today, a number of cities are part of such a network. Derrida added, plutôt que cultiver l'éthique de l'hospitalité, l'éthique et hospitalité, l'hospitalité, c'est la culture, which I translate as, rather than foster an ethics of hospitality, ethics itself is hospitality. Hospitality is culture. Had she been alive, Alice Salomon would have taken part in such a meeting even probably a leadership role. Interestingly enough, Salomon espoused notions of diversity, plurality, and difference, rather than universality. She recognized the profound differences among countries due to their respective historical paths, economic, political, cultural, social, which in turn led to different approaches to social work. Asked to lead the first international survey of social work, she states, and I quote, "It is extremely difficult to find common ground for international social work of a specialized kind, but equally stimulating to observe people who have no such experiences being initiated into this. There is no doubt that such meetings have unlimited possibilities. Delegates can learn in what manner the work that is being done in other countries is being done differently under different economic conditions and in countries with varied social, legal, and educational institutions. That social work and education for it depend, like industry, on location." She argued, quote, "We all have to learn not to be naively provincial in taking for granted that the systems of our own country can be made the yardstick for all continents." Very relevant today. She recognized what the French philosopher, again, Barbara Cassin, calls the untranslatables, concepts that do not travel well because they reflect different social realities. A number of initiatives made in recent years would have been incompatible with Salomon's worldview. She wouldn't have tried to replicate or impose a model of social work from one powerful nation onto others. Unfortunately, that has been the perspective of so many funded and unfunded transnational projects. Salomon would have assessed with greater diffidence the nature of local power relations and encouraged the work of reinvention at the local level, to cite a phrase used by Cassel. It struck me that Alice Salomon's perspective on plurality and reflectivity, which I discussed earlier, finds an echo in the work of Norbert Elias, who was of the first generation of sociologists. In the distinction he made between the established and the outsider, starting from his earliest article on it in 1956 to the co-authored book on the same topic. The dilemma being how to experience a social situation from the inside as an insider, and at the same time maintain a certain distance to be able to observe it. This idea takes up a whole section in Elias' autobiography, called in English, Notes on a Lifetime. In German, Norbert Elias über sich selbst. This is one of the aims of sociology, he argued. He also thought that being Jewish, secular, positioned him to take up such a stance. About Alice Salomon, we can perhaps say the same. And here I come to the concluding comments. There are similarities between Alice Salomon's context and our own today. Alas, unfortunately. At the same time, we pose some of the societal questions differently, no longer as the social question, but the Anthropocene. And our perspectives trace different horizons. Although in the recent months, in the recent years, we tend to feel that we are going back to the 1930s, and then what led on after that. Importantly, we are no longer in a state of exultation. Broad ideas of society no longer hold sway. In the present state of confusion, of divisions, we can perhaps insert some alternative thoughts and alternative feelings in a more tentative yet consistent way. A position argued by a generation of young social work scholars, and here I'm thinking of Tina Wilson of the University of British Columbia in Canada, who writes eloquently in favor of such position. To close, we turn our gaze back to the muse, Cleo, whose name from the Greek verb kleo means to recount, to make famous, or to celebrate. Today we are celebrating, we commemorate and praise, proclaim and rejoice. Thank you.
Now, just a few short words. Thank you very much, dear jury, for the help collecting our award winner, Julia Franz, Andrea Plöger, Sabine Toppe, Christian Widerschek, and Adrienne Feusel. It was a very mutual work, and I fairly enjoyed that in a very friendly atmosphere. Thank you very much. And since you said we need somebody to have our back, I would like to thank all the people behind the scene for their work. Thank you for technical and mental support. And now I think as Adrienne put it, it's about time for a drink. So I invite you to downstairs for a drink and something to eat. Have a nice evening. I hope you have inspiring talks tonight and enjoy.